first, everyone thought it was part of the show. The MC had just announced the bride and groom's first dance. The DJ had only played the opening bars of the song, and someone at table 3 even laughed as 3 men in dark suits strode confidently across the ballroom. Must be a surprise, he thought. Maybe another magician, or actors for one of the reception games. The laughter died before it could reach the neighboring tables. A woman sitting by the window was the first to notice the badge. She didn't recognize what it meant yet, but she felt instinctively that the evening had just stopped being a celebration. She set her wineglass down so abruptly that red wine splashed over the rim onto the tablecloth. Silence spread through the room, not all at once but in waves, moving from table to table as though someone were methodically switching off every conversation, one after another. The band finished the musical phrase and fell silent on its own. No one told them to stop. They simply sensed there was nothing left to play. Vanessa stood beneath the white rose wedding arch, still holding Richard's hand, still smiling at something the MC had said only a second earlier. She hadn't yet seen what everyone else in the room already had. 180 pairs of eyes were fixed not on her, but past her, toward the man who had stopped in the center of the ballroom with the badge displayed. She didn't turn around right away. First her head turned, then her shoulders. The smile lingered on her face for a second longer than it should have, frozen there, disconnected from her eyes, where a question had already begun to form. The agent spoke her full name with the calmness of someone asking for directions. The entire room, more than 200 guests, spoons suspended in midair, untouched glasses, unfinished toasts, froze in a single collective breath that no one dared release. I was sitting at table 7 near the aisle, wearing the gray suit she'd once jokingly called my funeral suit, quietly finishing my dessert. None of the guests had any idea that the next 40 minutes would destroy not only this wedding, but everything Vanessa Whitmore had spent the last 3 years building behind my back. But it hadn't started that way. 15 years earlier, I walked into an interview at her father Gerald Whitmore's construction company, carrying a folder full of financial reports under my arm, and hoping to land a job as a junior accountant. Gerald spent a long time flipping through my calculations. He grunted, tapped his pen against the desk, and finally said he hadn't seen that level of meticulous work in his office since his late business partner was still alive. Then he added something I never forgot. Numbers don't lie. People do. The words stayed with me as if they had been carved into my skin. 2 months later, at the company's annual picnic, I met Vanessa. She pulled up in her father's pickup truck wearing a white dress that looked more suited for the cover of a magazine than a backyard barbecue. She spent the evening telling stories about studying in Europe. I listened not out of politeness, but because I was genuinely fascinated. And because when she laughed, it was the kind of laugh you wanted to remember forever. We were married a year later. The wedding was modest, held in her parents' backyard beneath strings of lights that Gerald had hung himself while balancing on a wobbly ladder and muttering under his breath the whole time. After the ceremony, he hugged me and said he'd finally found someone he could trust, not only with his daughter, but with the company's finances as well. Those first years were simple and honest. I'd wake up at 6 every morning, make coffee, drive to the office, and spend my days sorting through invoices, contracts, and tax records for Whitmore Construction. Vanessa worked part-time in the marketing department, but she spent most of her free time with her friends at the country club. I was rarely invited. She always said I'd be bored listening to conversations about tennis tournaments and charity luncheons. I never complained. I believed that's what a marriage was supposed to be. One person lays the foundation, the other makes the house beautiful. What I didn't know then was that a foundation can be dismantled one brick at a time, so quietly that the homeowner doesn't notice until the roof begins to sag. The humiliation didn't begin with a bang. It crept in quietly, almost invisibly, like a crack in a foundation that you only notice years later, once spiderwebs have spread across the wall. At a family dinner celebrating her father's birthday, she told everyone at the table that I was, in her words, just a guy who's good at counting other people's money. Everyone laughed. I smiled because I didn't want to ruin the evening. For a second, the spoon froze halfway to my plate, and I felt my ears burn, not from embarrassment, but from the effort it took to hold my tongue. A month later, at a reception for the company's business partners, she introduced me by saying, "This is my husband. He's our accountant." in the same tone someone might use to apologize for a stain on the tablecloth. I still remember the people who looked away at that moment, not because they were embarrassed for me, but because they were embarrassed for her. Over the years, it stopped being the exception and became the rule. She criticized my clothes in front of guests, called my old car the embarrassment sitting in our driveway. And once, when I suggested we spend our anniversary in the mountains, she told her sister that romance ends where an accountant's paycheck begins. Her sister laughed and looked at me with something halfway between pity and curiosity, the way people look at a museum exhibit. I stayed quiet. I cleared the dishes from the table and washed them because I didn't want to make a scene. Something inside me settled lower and lower, layer after layer, like silt collecting on the bottom of a river. I kept telling myself that patience was just another form of love. I was wrong, but back then I couldn't even admit that to myself. Financially, she kept me on a short leash, even though on paper the opposite seemed true. My paycheck went into our joint account, but she controlled it because, as she put it, I'm better at managing the budget. She made expensive purchases without explanation, and whenever I asked where the money had gone, she'd say, "A man shouldn't be keeping track of someone else's spending," even though the money belonged to both of us. One day I found a bill in the mailbox for a set of expensive jewelry I'd never heard about. When I asked her about it, she said it was a birthday gift for a friend whose birthday I'd obviously forgotten. A friend by that name didn't even exist in her circle. I wouldn't learn that until much later. Vanessa's father, Gerald, was the only person in that family who ever treated me like an equal. He often invited me into his office, poured himself a glass of whiskey, which I rarely touched, and told me how he'd built the company from nothing after his first business partner betrayed him on a major city contract. "The one thing you can never forgive in business, Ethan," he'd say, slowly swirling the whiskey in his glass, "is someone betraying you after you've trusted them with your books." Back then, I would just nod, never imagining that years later those words would become a prophecy about his own daughter. 3 years ago, the company brought in a new contractor named Richard Hayes. He was charming, with a flawless smile and a reputation for solving problems faster than anyone else could even notice them. He showed up to meetings in suits that cost more than I made in a month, and he had a gift for making every person he spoke with feel like the most important one in the room, a talent I mistook at first for genuine sincerity. Vanessa started staying late at meetings with him, explaining that she was overseeing his contracts from the marketing side, even though marketing had absolutely nothing to do with contractor agreements. I noticed it long before I wanted to admit it, but I dismissed my suspicions as paranoia because I didn't want to believe the worst about the woman I'd spent more than 10 years with. Betrayal didn't come crashing down in a single devastating blow. It revealed itself through a series of tiny cracks that I failed to connect until it was too late. One evening, Vanessa left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. A message from Richard lit up the screen. "The transfer went through as planned. Everything will be cleaned up by Friday." I stood there with a mug of coffee in my hand and read those words 3 times, as if repeating them would somehow change their meaning. Steam curled up from the coffee and disappeared while I remained frozen, feeling something heavy turn over inside my chest. Over dinner I asked her about it. She looked at me with complete composure and said it had to do with the company's charitable foundation and was none of my concern. "You're the company's chief accountant, Ethan," she said, "but somehow you've decided that gives you the right to know absolutely everything about me." "I'm not asking about you, Vanessa," I replied. "I'm asking about transfers moving through your father's accounts." She set her fork down so sharply it clinked against the porcelain plate. Then she called me paranoid. She said I'd spent so many years buried in spreadsheets that I'd forgotten how to see real people. Not once did her voice waver. She delivered every word with the same calm tone she used when ordering coffee. The conversation ended because she simply got up from the table and walked into the bedroom, leaving me alone in the silence with the slow drip of the kitchen faucet I'd promised to fix back in the fall. I still remember that sound. Steady. Indifferent. As if the house itself were counting down the seconds until everything fell apart. There was another moment I replayed in my mind over and over, trying to figure out exactly when I stopped being a person to her and became nothing more than a function. It happened at her mother's birthday party, after most of the guests had switched from dinner to glasses of wine. Vanessa was telling the story of how we met, and at one point she turned to me with a smile that looked warm to everyone else but rehearsed to me. "You know," she said, raising her glass, I could have married anyone. Instead, I picked the man who knows how to keep the numbers straight. Every woman needs her own calculator. The guests laughed. Someone even applauded. I raised my glass with everyone else because the alternative was making a scene in front of 20 people, half of whom I didn't even know by name. But that night, lying in bed, I thought a word I'd been afraid to say even to myself. Enough. The real collapse didn't begin with a single blow. It began when I tried to fight back. And that fight had already been lost before it started. A few weeks after the incident with the phone, I stopped asking Vanessa questions and started asking the documents instead. As the company's chief accountant, I had full access to the financial records. I began comparing the numbers in our internal system with the figures being reported to investors. The discrepancies were small, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't used to scrutinizing decimal places. But I was. 3 transfers had been routed to the accounts of a shell company called Hayes Construction Solutions. A business that, as I soon discovered, existed only on paper and in a handful of bank statements. I gathered my preliminary findings and, still believing I could resolve everything within the family, showed them to Vanessa. It was the first and last mistake of that kind I ever made. "Have you lost your mind?" she asked, looking at the printouts as if I'd handed her something filthy. "You're accusing Richard of stealing based on a few numbers in a spreadsheet? I want to know where your father's company's money is going," I said. "That's my job. Your job is to count, Ethan, not investigate. There's a difference." 2 weeks later, I was called into the office of one of the firm's partners, a man named Frank Delgado. I'd known Frank for more than 10 years and trusted him almost as much as Gerald. Frank sat behind his desk with a folder in front of him. He never looked me in the eye. "Ethan, we've been informed of discrepancies in your reports from the last quarter," he said evenly, sounding as though he were reading from a prepared statement. "An internal audit is already underway." "The discrepancies I found myself and documented myself," I replied, my throat suddenly dry. "They're the fraudulent transfers through Hayes. The auditors see it differently. While the investigation is ongoing, you'll be placed on administrative leave." At the time, I had no idea that the documents I'd submitted as evidence had been quietly altered before they reached the auditors. Some of my own accounting records had been falsified to make it appear that I had personally authorized the transfers. Judging by everything I later uncovered, Vanessa had started laying the groundwork long before the night I saw that text message. She wasn't someone who acted on impulse. A month later, I was officially terminated for loss of confidence due to financial misconduct. At the time, Gerald was recovering in the hospital after heart surgery and was barely involved in running the company. Vanessa took full advantage of his absence with the same cold efficiency she used to manage our joint bank account. I lost the job I had devoted 12 years of my life to. 3 weeks later, Vanessa filed for divorce, telling her attorney she could no longer trust a man who was under investigation by his own company. The friends I had always considered mutual stopped returning my calls one by one, not because they believed the accusations, but because they didn't want to end up on the wrong side of the man who was about to inherit the company. I was left without a job, without a reputation, without a marriage, and with almost no money. My accounts had been frozen during the company's internal investigation. I rented a small room above a laundromat in another part of town, and for the first few weeks I barely left it, listening to the washing machines humming below as if they were counting down the hours of my new, much emptier life. I would stare at the ceiling, convinced this was the end, not metaphorically but literally. The end of everything I had spent the last 15 years building. The turning point didn't come all at once. It came like something soft slowly hardening into steel. One sleepless night, I pulled out an old leather notebook I'd carried with me since my days as a junior accountant. I opened it to a blank page and wrote a single word. Facts. Not revenge. Not justice. Facts. Because I knew the only weapon I had ever truly mastered was numbers, and numbers don't forget. I stopped calling former friends, asking them to put in a good word for me. I stopped sending Vanessa long messages trying to explain myself. I stopped crying at night, something I'd done quietly for the first 2 weeks so the neighbors wouldn't hear me through the paper-thin wall. Instead, I began rebuilding everything in my memory, one step at a time, every figure, every date, every conversation that might matter. I realized one simple truth. If Vanessa and Richard had built their scheme on forged documents, they had left traces somewhere. Banks don't like losing a paper trail, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it. I stopped asking the people who had stolen justice from me to give it back. I decided to create it myself, using the same tools that had earned me a living for the past 15 years. The first step was calling someone I'd remembered almost by accident, a friend of a friend who had once mentioned working in a financial crimes investigation unit. After 2 weeks of conversations and background checks, I was introduced to Special Agent Karen Mitchell from a federal agency. She had spent more than a decade investigating fraud in the construction industry. We met at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place with few customers and even fewer chances of running into someone we knew. Karen warned me right away that if I was looking for immediate payback, I had come to the wrong person. "This is going to take time," she said, stirring sugar into a cup of coffee she never actually drank. "We can't make a move until we have enough evidence to keep the case from falling apart in court over technicalities. You'll have to act as if you don't suspect a thing." "How long?" I asked. "Maybe 6 months. Maybe a year. It depends on how careful they are and how patient you can be." I kept the books for a company that spent 12 years praising my honesty and now accuses me of stealing, I replied. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's patience." Karen looked at me differently after that. Until then she'd seen me as nothing more than a victim and a witness. Now she seemed to see someone she could actually work with. She explained that I needed to avoid any direct contact with Richard or Vanessa. Anything suspicious on my part could make them nervous and cause them to shut everything down before the investigation gathered enough evidence. The next 8 months became the strangest period of my life. During the day, I took a modest accounting job at a small logistics company on the other side of town, where nobody knew my story. I did everything I could to blend in. In the evenings, I met with Karen and her team, handed over every new discovery, and helped reconstruct the chain of wire transfers that had passed through the same shell company, a business that existed only on paper and in a handful of bank statements. At the same time, I carefully maintained the image of a broken man for anyone who still had access to my life. At the only meeting I had with the divorce attorney, I spoke softly and agreed to almost all of Vanessa's demands except one. I insisted that the divorce not be finalized until the company's internal investigation had been completed, citing legal caution. Vanessa took it as just another sign of my indecision and didn't argue. She was far too confident in her victory to waste energy on details that seemed so insignificant. Through mutual acquaintances, or rather through the few people who still spoke to me out of pity, I learned that Vanessa and Richard had started appearing together openly about 6 months after I was fired, as if the mourning period for our marriage had ended the very day my resistance did. They began planning an extravagant wedding that was clearly far beyond the means of a marketing manager and a mid-level contractor. Karen Mitchell explained where the money was coming from. They had been siphoning off the company's last major funds before the planned sale of Whitmore Construction to an outside investor, a deal scheduled to close on the very day of their wedding. "They want to accomplish 2 things at once," Karen told me during one of our final meetings, tapping her pencil against the table. "She wants to get married and collect the proceeds from the sale before her father fully recovers and takes control of the company again." By then, Gerald was indeed recovering, but he was still too weak to manage the business himself and trusted the reports his daughter sent him completely. I spent a long time debating whether I should contact him directly, but Karen insisted we wait. Moving too soon could scare Richard into covering his tracks and destroy the chain of evidence they had spent months building. So I waited, watching from a distance as Vanessa picked out wedding flowers with money stolen from her own ailing father. One day, I almost ruined everything myself. It happened in the parking lot of a shopping center where I had stopped to buy groceries after my shift at the logistics company. I saw Vanessa walking out of a jewelry store with a small box in her hands, and for a moment, every ounce of self-control I had built over the previous months nearly crumbled. I wanted to walk up to her and ask whether she had any idea what was already closing in around her, to see even the faintest flicker of fear in her eyes before it was too late. I stood beside my car, gripping my keys so tightly my knuckles turned white, when my phone rang. It was Karen, as though she had sensed something was wrong from miles away. "Ethan, where are you right now?" she asked, hearing something in my voice that hadn't been there before. "In a parking lot. She's about 20 meters away." Leave. Right now. One chance encounter could cost us a year's worth of work. I got into my car and drove away without looking back. That evening, I kept reminding myself that impulsiveness was a luxury I could no longer afford. From that night on, I started keeping a separate, deeply personal list of reasons to hold on just a little longer. Not a list of grievances, but a list of facts that would eventually come together into a verdict. 2 weeks before the wedding, something happened that I hadn't expected. Richard, apparently sensing trouble after one of the banks delayed a large transfer for additional review, tried to move the remaining funds through a newly created shell company in another state. It was exactly the mistake Karen's team had been waiting months for. The transfer passed through an account that was already under federal surveillance, directly linking Richard's name to a much larger money laundering investigation the agency had been building for nearly 2 years. "We have enough for a warrant," Karen told me over the phone 3 days before the wedding, and for the first time I heard something close to satisfaction in her voice. "But we're not moving too early. We want to take them after the money has been transferred, and there's nowhere left for them to run." I asked why they had chosen the wedding day, and she answered almost emotionlessly that criminals are rarely as vulnerable, or as convinced of their own safety, as they are at the moment of their greatest triumph. She was right. Preparing for that day took almost as much out of me as the previous 8 months combined. I had to secure an invitation without raising suspicion, and I managed to do it through an old family friend who still believed I simply wanted to say goodbye like a civilized adult. I bought that same gray suit a week before the ceremony, standing in front of the fitting room mirror, rehearsing the expression I'd wear while sitting at table 7 as someone else's world collapsed around them. On the day of the wedding, seated at table 7 among guests Vanessa hadn't even bothered to remove from our old family guest list, I waited for the moment I had spent nearly a year preparing for. The waiter poured champagne, the orchestra tuned their instruments, and I methodically finished my dessert, knowing what no one else in that ballroom did. When the agent called out Vanessa Whitmore's name and asked her to accompany him for questioning, a murmur rippled through the room before swelling into outright panic. Richard tried to step between her and the agents, but another officer silently handed him a separate warrant bearing his own name. I watched Vanessa's expression change in a matter of seconds, from confusion to anger, and then to something that looked like genuine fear, something I had never seen in her before. Her fingers, still wrapped around the bouquet, began to tremble noticeably, and a single white rose petal drifted to the floor like the first piece of a structure finally coming apart. She swept her gaze across the room, searching for support, and for a brief moment her eyes settled on me. "You," she said quietly, but in the silence of the ballroom, the single word rang out as if she had shouted it. "You did this." "No, Vanessa," I replied calmly, without getting up from my chair. "You did. I just kept the records." The dominoes fell faster than anyone could have imagined. The investor who had been scheduled to finalize the purchase of Whitmore Construction later that day canceled the deal within an hour of hearing about the arrest, after learning that the company's CFO was under federal investigation. The bank handling Richard's accounts froze all related assets, including the house he and Vanessa had recently bought and planned to turn into their family home. Business partners who had spent years overlooking discrepancies in the company's financial reports rushed to distance themselves, fearing the investigation would reach them next. Gerald Whitmore learned the truth from federal investigators, not from his own daughter. 3 days after Vanessa's arrest, he came to see me at the small apartment I was renting above a laundromat. He looked paler than usual, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. When I opened the door, he said only one sentence, one I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. 12 years ago, I told you I trusted this company's numbers more than anyone's words. I should have trusted my own eyes too, Ethan. I'm sorry. He offered me the position of acting chief financial officer instead of simply returning as the company's accountant, while he focused on recovering his health. I accepted not out of revenge but because for the first time in months I felt like I was standing on solid ground. The investigation into Vanessa continued for several months, but the records I had preserved, combined with the evidence gathered by federal agents, gave prosecutors everything they needed to charge her with fraud, document forgery, and large-scale money laundering. Richard faced a separate criminal case tied to schemes he'd run in other states. His attorneys quickly explained that cooperating with prosecutors was his only realistic chance of receiving a lighter sentence. Without hesitation, he began testifying against Vanessa, destroying what remained of their alliance even faster than their wedding reception had fallen apart on the day they never actually got married. The divorce Vanessa had once expected to be little more than a formality became a long and complicated legal battle because of the criminal proceedings. During the division of assets, the court considered the financial records I had provided, which established the true source of the money. In the end, nearly everything she had expected to keep remained with the company, and beyond her reach. I didn't ask the court for anything more than what was necessary. All I wanted was an official acknowledgement that the signatures authorizing the fraudulent wire transfers had been forged. That admission became one of the foundations of the final judgment. She received several years of probation, was ordered to pay substantial restitution to the company, and was permanently barred from serving in executive financial management positions. Diana, my younger sister, who had flown out during the first weeks after I lost my job and had kept checking on me ever since, came to visit again. This time she wasn't there to rescue me. She came to celebrate my promotion. We were sitting in the kitchen of my new apartment when she asked whether I missed those 15 years with Vanessa, even just the good moments. I missed the person I was trying to become for her, I answered. But I don't miss the man I actually was while I stayed silent. She nodded, poured herself another cup of coffee, and said that for the first time in years, she didn't see me bent beneath an invisible weight. I was sitting up straight, as though someone had finally lifted a burden off my spine. For the first time in a very long while, I laughed not out of politeness, but because I truly felt something that came remarkably close to freedom. 8 months have passed since that wedding. I'm sitting in the office that once belonged solely to Gerald. Now we share it because he insisted on running the company together, calling it an investment in the man who's earned my trust twice. On the desk in front of me lies the same worn leather notebook. I still haven't replaced it, even though every current financial record has long since been transferred into secure digital systems with multiple independent backups. The lesson cost too much to ever forget. Sometimes in the evenings as I return to my new apartment, bright overlooking the park, purchased with money honestly earned, I think about the words Vanessa hurled across the ballroom that day. You did this. She was only half right. I really did do all of this. Just not at the moment she said those words. I'd been doing it for years, every evening sitting at my kitchen table, carefully copying numbers into a notebook that no one but me believed mattered. Gerald once asked me if I regretted not taking harsher revenge on her, something more public, more destructive, something that would have completely and permanently ruined her. We were sitting together in the office. Outside the window, the usual rainy evening was settling in, and I remained silent for a long time before answering. Justice built on patience and numbers will always outlast any burst of anger, I finally said. Because anger is forgotten, but facts remain in documents forever. He nodded, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and we both fell silent, listening to the rain beginning outside. There was nothing dramatic about that silence. Only a tired, peaceful understanding that the hardest part of the journey was finally behind us. Before leaving that evening, Gerald stopped in the doorway of the office and asked whether I regretted that the same gray suit Vanessa had once called my funeral suit had remained untouched in my closet ever since the wedding day. I told him I had taken it off that very night and never worn it again, because it had served its purpose. It had carried me calmly and with dignity through the most important hour of my life. After that, I no longer needed it. Gerald smiled, wished me a good night, and left. I stayed alone in the quiet office, listening as somewhere downstairs the doors of the company were being locked for the night. The company I had once nearly lost. The company I had reclaimed, not just for myself, but along with it, I had reclaimed myself. The person who had once been someone others could humiliate without consequence for 15 years straight, but who would never again allow himself to be used.